This is Speaking of Writers. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Hiking, a Beginner's Guide. The author is Doug Cline. If you always wanted to hike the backcountry but didn't know how to start, or maybe you didn't know what to bring, or found the wilderness downright scary, with this guide, you can cast your fears aside and let author Doug Cline prepare you for an enjoyable experience in the wilderness. Educate yourself on which necessities to carry, what to do in an emergency, and how to get the most out of all nature has to offer. Doug Cline grew up in Eastern Washington. The son of a school teacher, his family spent most of their summers hiking and camping. Cline learned a true love of nature and the skills to enjoy himself. Hiking, camping, fishing, and hunting were fun activities. Living in his rural town, outdoor activities were popular. His enjoyment of the wilderness taught him that it should be available to all, not locked away like some environmentalists would prefer. Nature is calming and there for all. This book is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Dorrance.com. I am happy to have Doug Cline join me now here on Speaking of Writers. Doug, welcome to this program.
Thank you.
So why this book for you?
I've been hiking and spending time in the wilderness since my parents took me out at 5 years old. It's just, there's too many people who don't really realize how nice it is just to sit out on a hillside overlooking a meadow, not looking at modern landscape, but just looking out at what nature has to offer. It's just calming. People should get out.
Doug, let's talk about preparation and good preparation, which will allow more enjoyment. What is important with preparing for a hike?
Well, you want to make sure that all of your equipment is in good order and that you yourself are fit for whatever trip that you want to take. Beginners, of course, there's a lot of short hikes that people can do. For brand new people doing it, I wouldn't expect them to go over maybe 5 mile trip. But you have to make sure that you have the right equipment, you're physically fit, and you have to be able to carry that load by yourself. Because of course, everything that you need is going to be on your back.
And mentally prepared too, right?
Oh yes, there. All of a sudden, sometimes there's a rainstorm, or if you get in the higher elevation, sometimes even a snowstorm in the middle of July that you're not expecting. But it's all part of the enjoyment, actually.
And I live in the mountains of North Carolina. And before we go out on hikes here too, be bear aware too in certain areas, right?
Yes, you really have to do your research on what is in your area. I've run into grizzly, I've run into cougar, I've even run into timber wolves. It all depends on where you're going and how to prepare just in case you run into basically a predator.
And what did you do? Let's start with the grizzly. What did you do when you did encounter this grizzly bear?
Well, the first thing I did is made sure that I stopped well before getting near him.
Yeah.
um, but but yeah, it's a lot of it times, especially with some like a bear, they tell you there's a lot of different ways out there to do it. To me, if you're hiking, you make sure that you minimize your movements. I'll keep an eye on the animal, make sure you know where that animal is. And because especially for a bear is going to stand up. When you are taller than they are, when they're down on all fours, they have poor eyesight, great smell, and they're fast, but they're going to stand up. And if with a backpack on, if you turn about 45 degrees to the side, you look like you have more behind you. And the bear realizes when they're standing up that they have no more behind them. So in a way, you make yourself look bigger than that bear is.
Mhm.
It, it's a good trick. Sometimes it works better than others, but at least it gives you a chance to have the animal decide to walk away rather than challenge something bigger.
It's also important to set realistic goals. All the trails here in this area will tell you the distance, half mile, mile and a half, 2 miles, 3 miles. When you, and that's a good start, I guess, right? So you'll know what you're up against in terms of distance.
Yes, topographical maps are really good when planning out your trip. So that way you know the ups and downs of the trail and the distances. So you'll be able to see on the map markers for how far you've gone. Not all trails have those. When I was growing up in Eastern Washington, originally we had some signs up, but the Forest Service came through and removed a lot of the signs because they were trying to remove, in a wilderness area, they're trying to remove as much signs of man as possible. Some ways that's a good idea. Some ways, when you get to a fork in the trail, it's always good to know which way to go. But yeah, be realistic and know what your limitations are and how far you actually intend to go versus how far you'll actually go.
Doug, let's talk about having an emergency plan. What is your emergency plan like when you set out on a hike?
I have a good amount of emergency equipment with me. I put together a small first aid kit that right now working in the medical field, I can pick up occasionally some outdated equipment. Like I do carry sutures in my first aid kit. That's not something that everybody's going to carry. But nowadays they have the civilian version of Quick Clot in case you do something that needs bleeding stopped. Be familiar with your first aid. That's really important. What are you going to do if you cut yourself and you're bleeding real bad? What do you do if you fall down and break something? I also carry an inReach with me nowadays. Any type of satellite connectivity is good. Use the technology that's available to us. That one's pretty nice because if I actually did fall and needed emergency, there's a SOS button on the side, and that sends a GPS coordinate directly to first responders.
Let's talk about the beautiful Cascade Mountains where when you got older, your parents started taking you hiking around those mountains. For those who have never been, describe them.
Very beautiful. God's country.
Mhm.
We have one of the largest wilderness areas in northeastern Washington, the Pasayten Wilderness. It's really something to see. A lot of times on the eastern Washington is more of a high desert. So when you get into the wilderness areas, there's not a lot of ground vegetation. You're just walking among the pine trees. But almost every road will take you up into the hills where you can just find a nice spot. And I had an art teacher one time try to describe art to me, and I said, my definition of art is sitting on top of a mountain, looking out over a wilderness meadow and seeing a deer grazing and watching an eagle fly overhead. Some things are just beautiful. It's everybody will get a different feel for it, but everybody should experience it.
And Doug, what would you like readers to take away from hiking a beginner's guide?
I tried to cut up contact every point that you may need. But once you've read it, if you carry it as a guide, there's a lot of stuff in there about where to go get your equipment, what type of equipment to get. And it doesn't have to be an expensive proposition either. Just, I guess the end message would be prepare. The better prepared you are, the more you're going to enjoy your time. Nobody wants to go out and find out that they forgot something or they weren't prepared and have a miserable time. Prepare ahead of time and just enjoy everything that wilderness has to offer.
So this is Hiking a Beginner's Guide, by the way, available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Endurance.com. Are you planning a sequel, the Advanced Guide, maybe?
I've thought about that. One of the things I did plan on is my father died a couple of years ago, and it turned out when we were clearing out his belongings, he kept trip notes of every trip he'd ever done. And I thought about making some sequels based upon some of the trips that he took.
Do you keep notes too? Do you keep trip notes like your dad did?
I never thought about it until we noticed that that's what he was doing. But I'm going to start doing it from now on.
Mhm. The book is Hiking: A Beginner's Guide. The author is Doug Cline. It is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Dorrance.com. Doug, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And this is Speaking of Writers.